B'Shem Hashem na'aseh v'nasliach. Masechet Berakhot, Daf Bet. Why does every Masechet start on Daf Bet? What happened to Daf Aleph? The simple reason is that when the Talmud was first printed in Venice in 1520, there was printed as the first page was the title page. It said Talmud Bavli, Masechet Berakhot, and other details about the printing. And then you turn the page over, and then Daf Bet starts the actual text. That is the Peshat reason. But there's an equally important Midrashic reason, which is that the Torah is a sea, the sea of the Talmud, without beginning, without end. Even after you finish the whole thing, you come right back to the beginning, and one is always in the middle, in the midst of the Torah, learning. Everything is connected to everything else. And so we jump right into Masechet Berakhot. The Mishnah has 9 chapters. The first 2 chapters are about Shema and the Berakhot of Kiryat Shema. So it's called Masechet Berakhot, and although Shema itself is not a beracha, but the Kiryat Shema is surrounded by Berakhot. So that's the first topic in the first 2 chapters. Now, chapters 4 and 5 are about the Amidah. Chapter 3, right in the middle, mentions both. So it's a connection between first 2 chapters about Shema, chapter 3 also about Shema, but mentions the Amidah, and then 4 or 5 is about the Amidah. So that's the set of fixed prayers. And then after that, chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all about Berakhot, that one says for fruits and vegetables and natural phenomenon and other topics. So that's about Berakhot specifically, that we say all day long and on special occasions. And so that's the split of the structure of the Mishnayot. So we begin with Shema, and you'd expect this to be talking. It is going to give all the details about Shema, when to say it, what to say, why, and so on. But interestingly, although we're in Masechet Zeraim, the reason why Berachot is in Masechet Zeraim is because in the later chapters, it's going to talk about the Berachot that one says for fruits and vegetables and so on. However, still we're going to make many references to Kodashim, to sacrifices and holy things. And that is because, as we will see, there is a deep connection between the Korbanot and the prayers. Both of them are called Avodah. Avodah of the Bet HaMikdash, and Tefillah is called Avodah Shebalev. And in many ways, we can think of Tefillah, you can say as a replacement, but even more accurately, it's a fulfillment, a continuation of the Korbanot. And in fact, even during the time of the Bet HaMikdash, while the Kohanim were making Korbanot, there were also prayers that were being recited. So it's actually all part of the same continuum of types of avodah that one does to show our service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here we go. Me'ematai korin et Shema ba'aravin. From what time? What's the earliest time when one may say Shema? At night. As the Gemara will introduce, there's an obligation to say Kiryat Shema b'shochpecha u'b'komecha, when one lies down and when one wakes up. So we're starting with the nighttime, and the Gemara will ask why we start with the night and not with the day. And the question is, even before we know what Shema is and what we say, what's the earliest time when one can say Shema at night in order to fulfill that obligation of recitation? And the answer is Misha'a shehakohanim nichnasim lechol bitrumatan, from the time that the Kohanim enter to eat terumah. Now, this time is in fact Set HaKochavim, when you see 3 medium stars, when it's pretty dark out. The Mishnah could have simply said Set HaKochavim, and then we would have known what it is. But it seems the Mishnah wants to connect Kiryat Shema to Terumah, which is quite interesting. Why? Because we know from Mishnah in Masechet Tamid says that during the day, in the morning, when the Kohanim would be preparing the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, they would do Shechita, and they would take the limbs it's a Korban Olah, and they would take it and put it first on the ramp of the Mizbeach, each of the different parts, and later on, they bring them from the ramp and actually put them on the fire on top. So first they put it on the ramp, and then yardu uba'u lahem lishkat hagazit likrot et Shema. They pause for a few moments, and after they put the limbs on the ramp, and then they go to lishkat hagazit, one of the courtyards, one of the sections in the Bet HaMikdash, to read Shema. And the person in charge, Amar lehem Mimune, Barachu beracha echad, v'hem barachu karu aset devarim. In the times of Bet HaMikdash, they would say the 10 Commandments every day. We don't say the 10 Commandments anymore. This is because the sages, after Christianity developed, and they said, only the 10 Commandments are important, only they are applicable. The rabbi said, no, all the mitzvot are equally applicable, and therefore they said, don't say the 10 Commandments so that nobody should make that mistake and think that the 10 Commandments are any more applicable than anything else. But in the Bet HaMikdash times, they used to say the 10 Commandments and Shema and Vayam Shamoa and Vayomer and so on. And then they would say other Berakhot, Shalosh Berakhot, Emet V'Yasiv, Avodah, Birkat Kohanim, which we have now are incorporated, Avodah, Zritzeh, Birkat Kohanim, those are incorporated into the Amidah. What you see, something is very, very important, is that already the basic structure of the Tefillah, as we have it today, where we have Shema and Birkot Kiryat Shema, and after that the Amidah, was already present in the time of the Bet HaMikdash. So you really can't say that Tefillah is a replacement of Korbanot, because they were saying the basic structure of the Tefillah even with the korbanot. So really it's better to say that Tefillah is an accompaniment and a continuation of the essence of what korbanot are all about. It's avodah. Hashem doesn't need the meat and the smell and the blood and or the wine, but rather it's an expression of our devotion, gratitude, and so on. And tefillah serves that same purpose. And so the parallel is quite striking. Just like in the times of the Bet HaMikdash, they would first recite Shema, and only then they would go and take the limbs of the Korban Tamid and actually put them on the fire, on the Mizbeach. So too, we can think of the Amidah as the equivalent of placing the Korban on the Mizbeach, and therefore the structure of the Mishnah of Berakhot and the structure of our prayers reflects the same order. First we say Shema, which is a kind of an introduction, and then Amidah, which is like the burning of the Korban itself. And so that's how we can think of it, as the Shema as the introduction to the Amidah, just as in the Bet HaMikdash they would recite Shema right before placing the Korban onto the Mizbeach. And so there's already a deep connection between Korbanot and Kiryat Shema, and it gets even deeper in the connection to Terumah. First, let's explain what the Mishnah is saying. From the time that Kohanim entered to eat Terumah, that's assuming if a Kohen is Tameh, he became Tameh during the day. For example, he touched a dead mouse or something like that. Then he would go to the mikveh at some point during the day, and then he's a Tevul Yom. Tevul Yom is partially tahor for some things, like for Maaser Sheni that he can eat, but yet not yet tahor enough to eat Terumah. It's only when it gets dark, then he can eat Terumah. So these Kohanim who were Tameh, they would not be able to eat terumah all day. They'd be waiting. They'd go to the mikveh during the day, and then they knew when Seta Kochavim is, and then they would gather together at Seta Kochavim to eat their terumah. Now, why mention Seta Kochavim? Why not just say Seta Kochavim? Why say when the Kohanim come in? There could be a simple reason that the Kohanim, they're experts and they'll be careful to only eat at Seta Kochavim, and everybody else will see the Kohanim. They see all the Kohanim leaving their house, coming and starting their meal, and they'll know, now it's Seta Kochavim. So maybe it's just a useful sign. I don't think that's so convincing, because really they could just look up at the sky and see if there are stars out, and then they'll know if it's Seta Kochavim or not. However, there might be something deeper. Number one, Shalom Albeck argues that it's not only some Kohanim, the ones that became Tameh for sure, that went to the mikveh, but actually HaKohanim, and he proves from some other sources that all Kohanim would go to the mikveh every day shortly before dark, just in case maybe they sat on something that a Zav had sat on and they became Tameh, maybe unknowingly. And so therefore they would refrain generally from Terumah during the day, because who knows what they touched or sat on, and they would go to the mikveh shortly before dark, and then, in fact, all Kohanim would go through the same process. So this would be something that everybody was doing, and therefore, in a way, more noticeable. But even more than that, Terumah had something that was especially symbolic. And we see that in this Midrash, in Sifrei Bemidbar, from the times of the Tanaim, that it says that the Kohanim would make Lasot, this Pasuk, Avodat Matana Eten Et Kehunatchem, that this is talking about the gifts that one gives to the Kohanim, and it's called avodah, even though it's a matana. La'asot achilat kodashim bigvulim ka'avodat mikdash ba'mikdash, meaning that we should treat the eating of holy foods like terumah, even outside of the mikdash, as if it were avodah of the mikdash in the mikdash, like sacrifices. And just like when a kohen comes to offer sacrifices, he's mikadesh yadav, he has to wash his hands first in the kiyod, and then he can go and perform sacrifices. So too, someone who eats kodashim outside of the mikdash should also wash his hands first and then eat. And so Kohanim would always wash their hands before Terumah, and in fact that's the source for us. Before eating bread, we do Netilat Yadayim, because we are all Mamlechet Kohanim, we are a kingdom of priests, and therefore we are, in a way, even though we're not eating Terumah, even just for a regular bread meal, we're going to treat that as if it's holy, as if it's Terumah, and wash our hands as if we are Kohanim. We want to try to elevate our meals from being something simply mundane to being something very special. And we have a fantastic story about Rabbi Tarfon. He came late to the Bet Midrash, and Rabban Gamliel says, "What happened? Why were you late?" And he said, "Shayiti Oved," says, I was serving in the Mikdash. Now, the Rabbi Tarfon lived after the Bet Mikdash was destroyed. So Rabban Gamliel was pretty confused, and he said, "Halachot devarecha tema. Everything you say is wondrous, Rabbi Tarfon. You're always confusing me. I don't know what you're talking about. You just came from temple service? There is no Bet Mikdash. V'chi yesh avodah achshav." And the Rabbi Tarfon answers something very important. Amar lo, harehu omer, avodat matana eten et kehunatchem, quoting this pasuk that is mentioned in Parashat Korach, that the gifts to the Kohen are called avodah, which means that we should consider the eating of kodashim outside the mikdash as if they were avodah in the mikdash. And from here, and there's several other proofs that are like this, we can show, in fact, this is Albeck argues again here, that terumah is considered a type of temple service. Even after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed, the eating of terumah is a type of continuity or replacement for it. And therefore, over here, when it says, when do you say Shema? At the same time that Kohanim eat terumah, it's making a further connection between not only Shema and terumah itself, but a double linkage, A equals B, B equals C. Eating terumah is like eating korbanot, is like performing korbanot, and therefore reciting Shema also is like performing korbanot, and that makes sense conceptually as well, because when saying Shema, we accept upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. We say Hashem is one. We accept the responsibility for the mitzvot. And that's what the korbanot are all about also, a korban olah, to show our total devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is not just saying, oh, it wants to teach you, happens to be the same time that Kohanim, then you'll know when it is. There's a deep literary, philosophical connection that the Mishnah is making. That's the beginning time of Shema. Ad Sof Hashmorah Harishona Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to see three opinions about the ending time. Until one say it? Rabbi Eliezer says until the first watch. In the Bet HaMikdash, there were 3 watches, 3 guards, 3 sets of people that would replace each other to make sure everything was going on well at night. And so the first watch, if you split the night of 12 hours into 3, would be 4 hours into the night. If you figure a typical day of 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., so this would be 10 p.m. Rabbi Eliezer is assuming that Beshochbecha means when you go to sleep, not while you are sleeping. And people go to sleep. Sometimes people would sleep early. It's dark out. Most people can't afford candles. And so it's dark, and they would eat, and then they would go to sleep, and they might go to sleep soon after it gets dark, and latest people will go to sleep by 10 p.m. There's not much else to do at night. Hachamim omerim ad chasot. Hachamim, however, say until midnight, the middle of the night. And we'll see the significance of that. Ad chatzot. Chatzot is also an important time for korbanot, many korbanot that one is allowed to eat during the day and at night. One has to eat before chatzot. So this is also a Bet HaMikdash related time, just as the Ashmurah is related to the watches in the Bet HaMikdash. Rabban Gamliel omer ad sheya'aleh amud hashachar. Rabban Gamliel says all night long. And he's understanding beshochbecha as while people are sleeping, not just when they go to sleep. And people are sleeping all night. Sometimes they may wake up early, they might go to sleep a little later, but all night is sleeping time, although this time also has a significance as related to korbanot, as we're about to see in the following story. So we have 3 opinions, and now we have a story. It's unusual to find a story in the Mishnah. There are several stories, but not all the time. In general, is this a law book? Is it a story book? Mishnah is mostly a book of laws, but these stories are very significant when we find them, and there's a lot we can learn from the stories as well. Maaseh, ubao bana mi bet hamishte, amru lo karinu et Shema. One time, the sons of Rabban Gamliel came from a wedding, and they were there all night at the wedding, and they came home and they told Rabban Gamliel, their father, we did not get a chance to say Kriyat Shema. Amar lahem, im lo ala amud hashachar, chayavin atem likrot. If the dawn has not arrived, then you must recite it. Some say, some versions have mutarim atem likrot. You're permitted to say it. But let's say chayavin, you still must say it. And this is consistent with Rabban Gamliel because he said, ad she'ela amud hashachar. So if we stop right here, the story would show that Rabban Gamliel actually practiced what he preached. We always wonder, whenever there's a machloket in the Mishnah, you have a majority and a minority. Did the minority practice their own opinion, or did they take a vote, and then even the minority practiced the majority opinion? Here, at least, if we stop at this point, it seems that Rabban Gamliel practiced his own opinion. And later on in the Mishnah, we'll see other stories where Rabban Gamliel also went against the majority and followed his own opinion. And so that might be the point of the original story. But now we have an additional comment. Velo zo bilbad amru, ela kol ma she'amru chachamim ad chasot, misvatan ad sheya'aleh amud hashachar. And it's not only in this case that the sages said until chatzot, but rather any time that the sages say you can do something until chatzot, actually, on a deoraita level, the mitzvah applies until Amud HaShachar. However, the rabbi said, oh, you know what? Do it before Chatzot in order to distance one from sin. In other words, it's a fence. And now we quote other examples. Hekter halabim ve'ebarim, misvatan ad she'el Amud HaShachar. The burning of the fats and the limbs. When you have a korban that you do shechita during the day and you sprinkle the blood, then whatever parts that are supposed to be put on the mizbeach, if it's a korban olah, all the parts, if it's a korban shalamim, some of the parts, those parts you can put on the mizbeach during the day or at night, until Amud HaShachar, you can put them on all night long. And similarly, Kol HaNechalim liyom echad, misvatan ad she'el Amud HaShachar. Some korbanot can be eaten like kodshe kodashim, like a korban hatat, can be eaten by the kohanim that day that you do shechita and that night. Now, the mitzvah mideoraita fundamentally is the kohanim could eat it all night until dawn. Imken lama amru chachamim ad chatzot. And yet, in those cases, chachamim don't say that you can eat it all night. They say until chatzot, meaning they add a fence. Why? Kedei larchik adam min avera, to distance a person from transgression. Because if you tell someone, oh, you have all night to do this, like Shema, you could do it all night. So naturally, people will say, I don't know, it's 7 p.m., 8 p.m. I don't say it now, I could say it later. They're always going to delay. And then, in the end, they'll fall asleep, and then they will forget to say it altogether. And therefore, this is a good idea, to say it as early as possible, and say it before Chatzot, and that way, they will not come to transgress. And so we have a few things that we show follow the same pattern. Now, Rashi points out that there's something interesting here. It's true that the Mishnayot and other places say that one should eat Kodesh Kodashim until Chatzot and not take the whole night. So that is true. The Chachamim do say that about eating. However, regarding burning the Chalabim and Evarim, it does not say in the Mishnah that one has to do it before Chatzot. In fact, it says you could do it all night. And so this is not even, this Kedel Archik that the rabbi said until Chatzot does not even apply to everything on this list. So it's interesting that it's even on this list. That's one interesting thing about this. Second interesting thing is, it's not clear who says V'lo zo bilbad. Is this Rabban Gamliel continuing his statement and saying, oh, by the way, I am not arguing on Chachamim, when they say, well, I said Ad Lemud HaShachar, and the Chachamim agree with me fundamentally that the mitzvah is even until the morning. Just they said Chasot, that's only a D'Rabbanan. And in that reading, therefore, if Rabban Gamliel is saying this, basically saying, don't think that I'm going against Chachamim. I agree with them, and they agree with me that you can do it until all night. Now, Rabban Gamliel could very well be that he does not have the gezerah. He doesn't say there's a fence. He says, no, you don't have to make a fence. People will say it, give them all night. Maybe they'll go to sleep early and wake up early, then they'll say it. Either way, they'll say it at some point. Chachamim say make a fence. But Chachamim would agree, since it's only a D'Rabbanan fence, probably they would agree that if B'di'avad, one did not say it before midnight, then one should still say it afterwards, because, well, what do you lose? And then you can fulfill at least Oraita. Even if you passed the Gezerah B'Drabanan, you should still be able to say it afterwards. Unless they're more extreme and they say the Gezerah is so strong. There are such Gezerot. There are examples of that where the rabbis make a Gezerah and then say, you know what, you can't do it after because that makes it stronger. Then someone will be sure to say it before. But Rabban Gamliel at least is saying, well, even Chachamim would agree with me. Now, again, it's not clear if Rabban Gamliel himself said this, or if this is the Mishnah that's adding to his words or saying it in its own words. And if so, that would be very interesting, because that would mean that while the original story is showing how Rabban Gamliel went against Chachamim, but the comment on the story is actually showing how they agree. And maybe that's part of the point of this very story, is to show that one should not go against the majority. And even in a case like this, where it looks like Rabban Gamliel is going against the majority, actually they're in agreement fundamentally. Better to say Shema before Chatzot. If b'diavad you missed it, you're at a wedding, there was something going on, then still say it even until the morning comes. Gemara. Tana hecha ka'eh dekataneh me'ematai. This Tana, the word Tana, has two meanings. It can mean the sages that are mentioned in the Mishnah, like Rabbi Eliezer, Rabban Gamliel, and so on. The word Tana can also mean a memorizer. Tana is actually the Aramaic of vishinantam, to repeat. When you want to memorize something, you repeat it many times. And throughout the times of the Amoraim, even the later sages, in every Bet Midrash, they would always have a Tana, meaning someone who has a very good memory, who made sure to memorize precisely all of the oral tradition. And so the Tana. So therefore, it's really the same word, but it can be used in both ways. The reciter of the Mishnah, the author of the Mishnah, or the sages in the Mishnah itself, all that is called Tana. So here it means the Tana, the author of this Mishnah. Hecha ka'eh. Where was he coming from that he tells us all of a sudden me'ematai? You don't start a conversation with, from what time? We didn't even know that there is an obligation to say Shema. What's your source? Is there something before this? This is the first Masechet, so we can't even look before where we are coming from. So So this is a kind of a surprise opening from what time before we even know the obligation. That's question number one. Vitu, furthermore, why is it starting with the nighttime and saying, when do you say Shema at night? Why not start in the morning? Like when you wake up in the morning, that's the beginning of the day. What's the earliest time that you can say Shema in the morning? Two questions, and now we're going to give two answers. The first one will actually answer both of them. Tana akera ka'eh, dichtib b'shochpecha ubkumecha, v'achikataneh. Zeman kiryat shema deshechiba emat, misha shekohanim nichnasin lechol b'trumatam. The Tana is actually relying on a pasuk. We can assume that everybody learns Chumash first. When they're a child, they learned Chumash, and they know the pasuk. And now it's jumping off the pasuk. So everybody knows the pasuk. B'shoch becha, you should recite these words when you lie down and when you get up. And so that's how we know. You already know the pasuk. And remember, all this was oral. And so if you're learning it from a teacher, face to face, then the teacher will say, Me'ematai, and the student will say, Me'ematai, what do you mean? How do you know? And the teacher will say, oh, remember the pasuk? So the teacher will give an introduction and will explain everything. In the way the Mishnah is kind of short notes that a teacher will expand upon. So the Tana is assuming that you already know the pasuk and is saying the time of Kiryat Shema when you lie down. When is that? You already know that you have to recite it. What's the time? And then the answer is when Kohanim enter to eat their terumah. That's answer number one, and that would answer both questions, both how we know that there's an obligation and also why we start with the nighttime. A second answer, Yalif meberiyato shel olam dichtiv vahi erev vahi boker yom echad. We are learning from the order of creation of the world, where it says Vahi Erev, it was evening, and then it was morning. So we start with the evening. Therefore, it makes sense to start with the time of Kiryat Shema in the evening. The second answer actually answers only the second question, but although we already have an answer to it, this is an additional answer, and this actually is going to introduce a theme. A lot of times the opening sugya in a masechet is a kind of overture to the entire masechet. And notice that we didn't have any names of Amoraim yet. This is anonymous, and it's bringing together a lot of very important themes that we will see later on. In fact, this pasuk will come up again in the fourth perek, and it's also introducing the timescape, the idea that is a pattern of evening and morning, and the fact that you're saying Shema at night and in the morning. It's not just that we're saying it twice a day. The nature of the Kiryat Shema and of the Berakhot are different at night as they are in the morning. And so this tefillah also has a different character at night. At night, one's going to sleep and resting, thinking about the dangers at night. And we're going to speak about Kiryat Shema al Hamita. And so this is thinking about what it means to be an Eved Hashem and declare that Hashem is one, and the mitzvot when at rest, when passive. And the daytime Kiryat Shema is when you go out, when you're going out to the marketplace, when you're going out on the road. Belechtecha baderech, and that has a different sense of being active and following in Hashem's ways and performing mitzvot when one is active. And so actually, this pasuk is going to play a very important role, in fact, in the structure of this whole perek, that all the Mishnah in this perek mention Yom and Laila, the contrast between them. The last Mishnah in this perek is going to talk about how we know that we mention Yetziat Mitzrayim, even at night, even when it's dark and seems dangerous and persecution. Do we hope for Yetziat Mitzrayim? Do we hope for Geulah? So this pasuk is, even though it's really not necessary as an answer, because we already answered the question, I think is inserted here to help us start thinking about the contrast between the feelings, emotions, and attitude of day versus night. Now we ask, Sefa dekatani bashacha mebarech shetayim lefaneha, v'achat la'achareha, ba'erev mebarech shetayim lefaneha, u'shetayim la'achareha. In a later Mishnah, in this Masechet, it says the opposite order, because it says, in the morning, we recite 2 Berakhot before Shema, which is what we do, Yosed Or and Avat Olam, and one after, Emet V'Yasib. At night, we recite 2 Berakhot before Shema and on 2 Berakhot after. So in this Mishnah, why is it mentioned the morning first and then at night? Litnei de'abit beresha. Why not do the nighttime first? You just said vahi erev vahi boker that we should say the nighttime first. Why in that Mishnah does it say morning first? And the answer is Tana patach be'arbit v'hadar taneh b'shachrit. Deka'eh b'shachrit paresh mileh de shachrit v'hadar parish mileh de arbit. The Tana, the author of the Mishnah, starts us off in this opening Mishnah with arbit. And then the next Mishnah right after this is going to say, what is the time for reciting Shema in the morning? So we go from the time of Shema at night to the time of Shema in the morning, which makes sense. B'shochbecha and then ubkumecha. Vahi erev, vahi boker. But once it's on the topic of the morning, then it's going to continue with that theme and explain the blessings of the Berakhot of Kiryat Shema of the morning, and then after it finishes that, it'll go back to Arbit. That's the way of the Mishnah. Even once it goes into a subject, it'll continue on that subject till it finishes it off, and then go back to the original, and this creates a nice structure for these Mishnayot, an A-B-B-A structure, starting with the nighttime, going to the morning, continuing with the morning Berakhot, and then ending with the nighttime Berakhot.
Amar Mor, Misha shekohanim nichnasim lechol bitrumatan. Amar Mor means the master said. We're quoting a piece of something that we already said earlier, which is a quote from the Mishnah that says the earliest time of Shema is when the Kohanim enter to eat their terumah. Mikidi Kohanim emat kach li terumah mishat set kochavim litne mishat set kochavim. Now, when do Kohanim go and eat their terumah? It's when the stars come out. So why doesn't the Mishnah say simply from the time of Set HaKochavim? Why give this roundabout answer? We suggested a hashkafic, philosophical reason earlier. However, the Gemara is going to give a different legal reason. Mileta agav orche kamashmalan kohanim emat kachli betruma mishat Set HaKochavim. It wanted to teach us something by the way and tell us that Kohanim, when can they start eating teruma? From the time of Set HaKochavim. This is very good. We don't have to wait all the way till later on in Seder Zeraim, when it gets to the laws of Terumah, and to learn the Set HaKochavim, and when that is, what the importance is, that's when Kohanim can eat Terumah. We get 2-for-1 special. We get to learn about the laws of Kiryat Shema, and then, by the way, it'll say, when the Kohanim can eat Terumah. And then the student will ask, and when is that? That's Set HaKochavim. So it's an opportunity to embed more information, pack it into this one Mishnah. So this is a good educational exercise. Now, what else might one have thought? When else do Kohanim? When else would you have thought Kohanim have to wait so that they can eat terumah? Well, it's to teach you that you don't have to wait for kapara, for atonement through korbanot. Let's say it's not a simple tum'ah, like just touching a dead mouse, where you have to just go to the mikveh and you go at night. Let's say it's a mesorah or a zav, where they have to go through a 7-day purification process. They go to the mikveh on the last day. They wait till nighttime, but they are not 100% tahor until the 8th day, when they bring their korbanot. They cannot go into the mikdash, nor can they eat korbanot, eat kodashim, until they bring their korbanot on the 8th day. And so, I might have thought that the Kohanim cannot eat terumah until the 8th day, if they have that type of tum'ah upon them. And so therefore, this Mishnah comes and says, no, don't think that you have to wait till the 8th day for kapara, for atonement, and bringing the korbanot. Even for those people, Set HaKochavim, after the 7th day is sufficient. Kidetanya. And we learn all this in a baraita that says, Uba hashemesh vetaher. This pasuk is from Vayikra. We could look at the pasuk inside. It says, Nefesh asher tigat bo v'tame'a ad ha'arev. A person who touches something tameh will become tameh until the evening. V'lo yochal min hakodashim ki im rachas besaro b'mayim. He cannot eat from holy things like terumah until he washes his body, meaning he goes to a mikveh. Uba hashemesh v'taher. And the sun comes, ba. Now, what does uba hashemesh mean? Now, in English, when we say, here comes the sun, that sounds like the sun is coming out, is rising. But in Hebrew, generally, uba hashemesh means it goes away, sunset. The idea is that yatsa, when the sun comes out, right, Hashemesh yatsa, then that's the morning. And then ba means it goes back to its place, back to its storage place, where it goes at night, uba Hashemesh. It even says so in Kohelet, Zarach Hashemesh, uba Hashemesh. Zarach clearly is, it's coming up, and uba Hashemesh is then when it goes down. So here, as you see the pasuk, simple reading is, in fact, that he goes to the mikveh, and then the sun sets, v'taher, and then the simple reading of v'taher is going on the person, and then he is tahor, and he can eat from kodashim, ki lachmohu, that's his food, it's coming to him, so he shouldn't have to wait any longer than that. But we're going to see a couple of alternative possible interpretations of this pasuk. So, biat shimsho me'akavto melechol bitruma, ve'en kaparato me'akavto melechol teruma. Bitruma. What do we learn from this pasuk? That it's only the setting of the sun that prevents him from eating teruma, and not the kapara, not atonement through sacrifices, will not prevent him from eating teruma. That's what the pasuk teaches us, and that's also what our Mishnah teaches us by saying, when you say Shema at night, surely when you say, when's the earliest you could say it at night? Nobody would think that that's the next day in the morning when people bring korbanot. So it's obvious that it's not then. And so we can learn two things in one, that Kirat Shema is Seta Kochavim, and that's also when Kohanim eat teruma. They can do so at night and do not have to wait till the 8th day when they bring korbanot. But now we challenge that further and ask, how do you know when you're reading this pasuk that uba hashemesh means that the sun has set, and taher is referring to the day, that the day has been purified in the sense that it's completed. When something is purified, it's done, it's totally finished. And so that's seta kochavim. So uba hashemesh means sunset, taher means, and also it's completely done, and seta kochavim. That's how we have been reading the pasuk. And that's what we're learning from, is Seta Kochavim. But how do you know to read it that way? You can interpret it differently. Dema biat orohu umay v'taher tahad gavra. Maybe ba hashemesh means sunrise. The bi'ah, the coming, is the coming of the light of the sun in the morning. And taher is referring to the person, the kohen, that he has to do something. He has to bring his korbanot in order to effectuate his full tahara. Maybe the pasuk means that. It's actually talking about two steps. One about the day has come, sunrise, and now at sunrise you can start bringing korbanot. V'taher, he brings his korbanot, and only then he can eat teruma. Amar Rabba Rav Shela, im ken lemakera veyitar may v'taher tahar yomar. Rabba Rav Shela says, if so, then the pasuk should have said veyitar, an active verb, meaning uba shemesh, the sun will rise, and then he will go and do his tahara sacrifices. But it doesn't say an active verb. V'taher is, it will become purified. In other words, by itself. And therefore, it must be referring to the day itself is purified by being complete and the stars coming out. And this is a popular saying that is said, folks saying, the sun has set and the day is purified. Idaki, meaning to be pure, it's the Aramaic for veyitar, or tvetaher, it has become pure. And since that's the common folk saying, you see that the Torah is using that type of phrase also. The day itself is finished. And that's the answer why you should not read it in the other way. Something very interesting over here is that, in fact, there were other groups of Jews, sectarians, like the Dead Sea sect, the Sadducees, that actually agreed with that interpretation. And they said you cannot eat teruma at night just because Seta Kochavim came. Rather, they said one has to wait till the next day and until the Kohen is totally pure. Only then can he eat teruma. And so the Ba Hashemesh, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, could mean the morning, or it might even mean, if it means sunset, because Uba Shemesh generally does mean sunset, it might mean sunset on the 8th day. You have to wait till you bring your korbanot, and then when that day finishes, only then can you eat terumah. So this possibility that the Gemara is bringing is not just a theoretical possibility of how someone might read the pasuk. It seems to be an actual practice that was done by some Jews that the rabbis think is totally wrong. And then you could understand why didn't the Mishnah wait till Masechet Terumot to talk about this? So you'll learn about it there when it comes up. To put this in the opening Masechet, this was a central topic of discussion. It was very heated debates about this whole area of Tivul Yom. When does a person become tameh enough to eat Maaseh Sheni, to perform Para Aduma, and then Set Kochavim for Terumah, and then the next day for Korbanot, is the way the rabbi said it. But this was a huge discussion and huge fights over this. And so to emphasize this halacha against those sectarians could be another explanation altogether for why the Mishnah goes out of its way to say Kriyat Shema at night is not to say Set Kochavim, say when the Kohanim eat, so that everybody will know. Don't be confused by that halacha in case you meet someone from the Dead Sea sect and tells you, oh, you have to wait till the next day. No. I know this first Mishnah, and it is in fact Set Kochavim. In the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, they had the same similar discussion, same question, but they had not heard the answer of Rabba bar Rav Shela that otherwise the Torah should have said V'yitar, and V'ataher is clearly going on the day. So in their version of the discussion, it went a little differently. They had a similar question. How do you interpret this pasuk? Do you say Uba Shemesh means sunset, and Taher means that Seta Kochavim, the day is completed and purified, and therefore one can eat terumah at night? Or should we interpret Biat Oro, that Biat Bahashemesh means the light of the sun has come, sunrise, and Tehed is referring to the person who brings his korbanot, and therefore he can only eat terumah the next day. Then the sages in the West, since they did not have that tradition and learn it from the fact that it says v'taher in passive instead of v'yitar as an active verb, but instead they learn it from a baraita this is a baraita that we're going to read later on this very daf. Midikatane baraita siman ladavar set kochavim shema mina biachim shohu umay v'taher tahad yoma. In the baraita says that the earliest time one can say Shema is, in fact, when the kohanim eat terumah, and the baraita adds a sign for this is set kochavim. So it's clear from the baraita that in fact it means set kochavim, and that pasuk Uba Hashemesh means when the sun sets, and Taher means when the day is finished and it's the stars come out.
Amar Mor Misha Shakoanim Nichnasin Lechol Bitrumata. Now we quote once again that line from the Mishnah that the earliest time to say Shema at night is when Kohanim begin eating terumah. Urminhu, we have a contradiction from a baraita. We're going to quote 3 baraitot, so we'll call this baraita number 1. Me'matai korin et Shema ba'aravin, mishe'ani nichnas le'echol pito bemelach ad sha'a she'omed lipater mitoch seudato. From when can one say Shema? The earliest time is when a poor person comes in to eat his simple meal of bread and salt. And it lasts until he finishes his meal and leaves. Now, that is a pretty short time. He's not eating a big lavish meal. It's a pretty short meal. And so that would mean that the ending time of Shema is just a few minutes after the beginning time. So the Gemara comments, Sefa vadai peliga amatnitin. Resha milema peliga amatnitin. The Sefa of the ending time certainly disagrees with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah brought 3 opinions, but the earliest of them is Rabbi Eliezer, who says from 10 p.m. But this would be like just a few minutes, 20 minutes, half hour for him to eat his meal. So this is certainly a 4th opinion that does not accord with any of the opinions in our Mishnah. But how about the Resha, the beginning time? Maybe that's the same time
maybe Kohanim and poor people eat at the same time. It's not clear. Do poor people eat earlier because they only have bread and salt, so they don't have to go and prepare their meal and go and get meat and cook it and all that. So maybe they eat earlier. Also, they cannot afford a lamp, and so they're eating earlier so that they can see what they're doing. Perhaps, we don't know. Or maybe they're eating later. Maybe it takes them time to get that a scrap of food that they have to go around and asking people for it. So we're not sure. Is it the same time or not? So we say, La ani vekohen chad shiurahu. Let us propose that, no, the Beraita is not in disagreement with the Mishnah, and the poor person and the Kohen eat at the same time. We're going to try to prove that this is true. All things being equal, we would prefer to minimize on controversies. How many different opinions are there? We'd rather say that there's fewer opinions and it's just expressing the same idea in different words. There might be a conceptual idea behind this also, which is that if in fact the Kohanim eating terumah, this is something special, it's a special meal, this is in fact holy food, and we saw before that a Kohen eating terumah is considered as if the Kohen is preparing a Korban. So eating holy food is like preparing a Korban. Perhaps this hypothesis that the Ani eating his plain meal at the same time, perhaps we should think of even the non-Kohanim. When we eat a meal, especially a poor person who really appreciates his food, he comes with humility and gratitude that he has something to eat. And so that poor person's food, we should consider also like a Kohen eating terumah, which is also like someone preparing a Korban. So perhaps that's the idea here of the hypothesis. Okay, so we're going to try to prove that the poor person and the Kohen both eat at Seta Kochavim, and therefore this Baraita is in agreement with our Mishnah about the beginning time. But now we have a second Baraita that says otherwise. Another Baraita, there are many Baraitot, all different oral traditions that various sages and schools taught, and they each have a different style and even different opinions and number of opinions. For whatever reason, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and the Mishnah chose only a few of them, the key ones that one needs to know. But in fact, they chose from among many. So here we ask the same question. What's the earliest time? Rabbi Meir has a different opinion altogether from the time when regular people, not just poor people or Kohanim, when everyone enters to eat their bread on Erev Shabbat. Now, Erev Shabbat might be a different time than most other nights. On the one hand, perhaps they're eating earlier because the meal is already prepared from Friday. So they're not cooking anything after sunset. So since everything's all ready, so they're eating earlier, as we do, especially in the summer, we bring in Shabbat earlier. Or perhaps it's later because they have to go to Bet Knesset and bring in Shabbat and say Arbit, and then by the time they get home and they have lamps because you have Friday night lights, and so they can eat later. So it's not clear if this is the same time or not. Conceptually, philosophically, perhaps it's interesting that they're all about eating times, and perhaps this opinion of Rabbi Meir is saying, you know what, you should think not only of Kohanim eating terumah as being like a Korban, and not only poor people who are eating a simple meal, they put some salt, putting a salt like we put salt on Korbanot, but you should think of even everyone who eats a Shabbat meal. This is a holy meal, a special thing. And so our Shabbat meal also we should elevate to be like eating terumah, like preparing korbanot. Perhaps it's conceptual. But in any case, that's Rabbi's opinion. Hachamim omrim, b'shas shekohanim zakayin lechol b'trumatan, siman l'davar seta kochavim. The Hachamim say, from when the Kohanim are merit, or when they have the ability to eat terumah, and a sign for this time is, in fact, Seta Kochavim. This is the Braita that we referred to above, that in Eretz Israel, they said, we can prove from here that it's Seta Kochavim. Anyway, the Chachamim here are the same as the anonymous opinion in the beginning of our Mishnah, or in the beginning of our Mishnah actually might be the Eliezer. We're going to discuss that in a few minutes. V'afal pi she'en re'aya l'davar, zecher l'davar shneimar, v'anachnu osim b'melacha, v'chesem machazikim bar machim, me'alot ha'shachar had Seta Kochavim, v'omer, v'hiu lanu halayla mishmar v'hayom melacha. Now, even though there's no absolute proof that the earliest time when one can say Shema is Set HaKochavim, however, there is zecher ladavar. There's not going to be an absolute proof. Number one, it's from Nehemiah, not from the Torah. And generally, we're not going to learn halachot from Nevi'im and Ketuvim. We learn halachot from the Torah. Furthermore, the pasuk in Nehemiah is not talking about eating terumah or saying Kiryat Shema. It's talking about the work that was done to rebuild the walls of Yerushalayim. And it mentions day and night, and so we can figure out a definition of day and night from it. It says that we were involved in the melacha, in the construction of the wall, and half the people were holding spears because there were enemies, Samaritans and other Arabs that did not want the Jews to rebuild the wall. And so they were coming and attacking the construction workers, and they were standing there from Alot HaShachar, from dawn until Set HaKochavim, until night. And so they were there and they were working all day long, even from the earliest till the latest time, until it got dark, until it's totally dark. And another pasuk in the same context, 2 pasukim later, says that the night was for mishmar. We had to be on guard at night so that they wouldn't come and break it. And the daytime was for melacha. Now, why do we need 2 pasukim? What's this ve'omer? What's it coming to add? My ve'omer, so is the Gemara taking a break from the Baraita to teach us what this pasuk is adding. If I had only the first pasuk, I know it says here that in the first pasuk that they were working from dawn until Set HaKochavim. And if we assume they're working during the day, so then that would mean that day extends till Set HaKochavim. So therefore, Shema, you have to say at night, not during the day, so therefore you can't say it before Set HaKochavim. But however, you might think that when the sun sets is actually night already, at sunset, not at Set HaKochavim, which is some 20 minutes or a half hour later, depending on where you are. And they were the workers, they were working later than nightfall and earlier than when the day starts. So they were working extra hours overtime. So you might think that they were working overtime till Set HaKochavim, but in fact, legally a day ends at sunset. You might argue that. That's why I need the second pasuk, Tashema, Vahiu lanu halayla mishmar v'hayom melacha. The pasuk comes and says, well, we were guarding at night, but we were working during the day. Since we know they were working till Set HaKochavim, that means till Set HaKochavim is considered day. And you can't say Shema during the day because you have to say Beshoch Pecha at night. And therefore, that's a hint that the Set HaKochavim is the right time to begin saying Shema. It's not an absolute proof because, okay, they're talking about the workers and maybe they're using the terms more loosely, not legally in the context of Kiryat Shema or Terumah. And so, therefore, it is a hint, although not an absolute proof. Now, back to our argument. Let's assume for the moment that the time when poor people eat, which was Baraita number 1, said poor people, and Bnei Adam and other people, when they eat on Friday night, let's assume that that is the same time, whenever that is. And V'yamart ani v'kohen chad shiurahu hachamim hainu Rabbi Meir. If you say that poor people eat at the same time that Kohanim eat terumah, then we have a problem because Chachamim will be the same as Rabbi Meir. In other words, if we start with the assumption that Aniyim and Kohanim eat at the same time, well, then in that case, Rabbi Meir here, who says that it's the time that people eat, and if that's the same time that poor people eat, and we're trying to prove that poor people and Kohanim eat at the same time, well, then you have Rabbi Meir saying the same thing as Chachamim, but that can't be because you see here they are back to back in this Baraita, meaning that they're arguing. Chachamim omrim, but they say that's different from Rabbi Meir. Whenever you say Chachamim omrim rather than Amiru Chachamim, it means they're arguing, and so therefore it must be that the time that Kohanim eat is different from when poor people eat. If in fact poor people eat at the same time as everybody else, there has to be a distinction. So isn't that a rejection of our hypothesis? So now we have to reject our hypothesis, and in fact, conclude that poor people eat at a different time than Kohanim. But now we revive the hypothesis, not necessarily. La, ani v'kohen chad shiurahu, ve'ani u'bnei adam lav chad shiurahu. We were assuming over here that poor people and general people on Friday night eat at the same time. But that's not necessarily true. And as long as we reject that, then we can maintain the original hypothesis that poor people and Kohanim eat at the same time. And in that case, the first baraita that says poor people would be the same as Chachamim in the second Beraita, whereas Rabbi Meir in the second Beraita, he has his own opinion, different opinion, that it's when regular people eat on Friday night. Okay, so now we upheld the thesis, but now we're going to bring a third Beraita that will be a final refutation of it. Really? Is it true? Can it be that poor people and Kohanim eat at the same time? What do you mean who? Another Beraita, same question, but this one's going to have even more opinions. Rabbi Eliezer says it's from the time that Shabbat becomes Kadosh on Erev Shabbat. That would mean sunset. So that would be an earlier time. It is possible to understand Rabbi Eliezer as the time when people say Kiddush, Shekadash, when people make it holy, in which case it would be similar to the time when people begin their meal. Okay, so one way or another, let's understand it simply as sunset. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Mishashe Kohanim Metoharim Lechol Bitrumatan. Rabbi Yoshua says the standard answer when Kohanim become tahor and can eat teruma, which seems to be Seta Kochavim. Rabbi Meir Omer Mishashe Kohanim Tovlin Lechol Bitrumatan. Interestingly, Rabbi Meir says it's earlier. It's when the Kohanim go to the mikveh so that they can eat teruma, which has to be definitely earlier than the time that they can eat. By definition, you have to go to the mikveh during the day so that you can eat the teruma at night. So this is definitely before Seta Kochavim. That's interesting. How could it be made to say that you could say the nighttime Shema when by definition is still day? The Gemara will discuss this in a bit. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, v'lo kohanim be'ojomim tovlim. But this is the question of Rabbi Yehuda himself, who says, wait, kohanim have to go to the mikveh beforehand during the day. How could you say Shema? Rabbi Meir will have an answer later on. Rabbi Chanina Omer Misha she'ani nichnas lechol pito ba melach. Rabbi Chanina now says that it's when the poor people come and eat their bread with salt. That was the opinion in the first Baraita. Rabbi Achai ve'amri la, Rabbi Acha Omer, Misha shero b'nei adam nichnasin lehasev. Rabbi Achai, or some say Rabbi Acha, this very similar name, says it's when most people enter to recline during their meal. And this might mean even during a weekday meal. Lehasev might be a special meal, like for a Shabbat meal, it's possible, but it doesn't say Shabbat, so it might be any meal. And conceptually, this might be teaching that in fact every meal, even of a regular person, not just a Kohen or a poor person, and not only Shabbat, any meal, we should elevate and be like eating teruma, which is in fact why until today we wash our hands for any meal. And so he's saying even every meal. Now it's not clear which of these is a little bit earlier, which of these is later. Are some of them, in fact, the same time, and just conceptually, where they're arguing about how to think of the time of Shema and how to think of the meals and which one of the meals we should think of as elevated or not? It's not clear, but it is presented as a controversy, a legal controversy, and therefore, presumably, each of these is a slightly different time. But here's the point for us. If you say, as we did before in the thesis, that a poor person and a Kohen eat at the same time, well then Rabbi Chanina, who says when the poor person enters, and Rabbi Yoshua, who says when a Kohanim eats teruma, well then they would be the same and they wouldn't be arguing. And the presentation of this Baraita is that they're arguing, and therefore there must be different times. We can conclude that in fact the time when poor people eat and when Kohanim eat are different times. Heminahu me'ochad. Which of them is later? We know that Kohanim eat at Set HaKochavim, but the poor people, is it earlier or later than that? Mistabera de'ani me'ochad. Di amart de'ani muktam. Rabbi Chanina hainu Rabbi Eliezer. Ela lav shema'amina de'ani me'ochad shema'amina. It makes sense that the poor person would be eating later than the Kohanim, because if you think that the poor person is eating earlier than them, then Rabbi Chanina, who says when a poor person eats, and Rabbi Eliezer, he's the one that said from the time when the day is sanctified, which is also earlier, that's at sunset. We're assuming that once you say earlier, it's not going to be so many fine distinctions between something earlier than Set HaKochavim. And so therefore, if the poor people is earlier, then when is it going to be? Not just any random time. I guess it means sunset. Well, then that would be the same as then Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Eliezer would be the same, and they seem to be arguing. So it can't be that at that time. Therefore, it must be that the poor person actually eats later, and that would represent a later time. Now, citing something back from that baraita, we said that Rabbi Yehuda argued against Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said it's when the Kohanim go to the mikveh. But Rabbi Yehuda countered and said, Kohanim, they go to the mikveh during the day. And so how could you say Shema when it's day? Shapir kamar le Rabbi Yehuda le Rabbi Meir. Gemara notes, this is really a good question that Rabbi Yehuda asks Rabbi Meir. In fact, how could you go say Shema during the day when you go to the mikveh? Rabbi Meir hachi kamar le. Mi savarat ana aben hashemashot didach ka'amina, ana aben hashemashot Rabbi Yoseh ka'amina. Damar Rabbi Yoseh, ben השמשות כהרף עין, זה נכנס וזה יוצא, ואי אפשר לעמוד עליו. רבי מאיר says, did you think that I agree with your opinion about the definition of Ben HaShemashot? Ben HaShemashot literally is between the suns, meaning twilight, between when the sun starts going down and when it completely goes down. Did you think I meant your definition? I meant the definition of Rabbi Yoseh. I'm following him. Well, what did they say? According to Rabbi Yehuda, Ben HaShemashot is a time period. It extends a few minutes. Is a beginning and then the few minutes and then the end. And so, according to that, he would say you have to go to the mikveh before Ben HaShemashot starts, which would be significantly before Set HaKochavim. And this is Shema at night. So you can't say Shema at night significantly before Set HaKochavim. That was the basis of Rabbi Yehuda's question. But Rabbi Meir says, I'm not following your definition that Ben HaShemashot spans a few minutes, but rather I follow Rabbi Yoseh, who says Ben HaShemashot is a split second, as fast as the blink of an eye. One comes in and one goes out, meaning the day ends and night begins in one split second, and that's it. That's Ben HaShemashot. And nobody can even quantify how fast it is. In other words, according to the Yoseh, the moment of Set HaKochavim, whatever time that is, let's say 6:30, so that's it. 6:29 is day, 6:30 is night. And therefore, the Kohen can go to the mikveh at 6:29, and that would be the time when you say Shema. So you say, oh, it's daytime. Yeah, but not really, because you're saying it right at the cusp of nighttime, right at that moment, and then it's already basically the same as the time that you can eat terumah, because it's just going to be a few seconds later, and therefore Rabbi Meir says, I have no problem. We ask, Kashya de Rabbi Meir ad Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir seems to say two different things. In the second baraita, he said it's when people eat on Erev Shabbat. In the third baraita, he said it's when Kohanim go to the mikveh. Well, which one is it? And the answer is Tere Tana'e Alibad Rabbi Meir. In fact, there are two traditions in the name of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said something, but there was one memorizer, one tradition, remembered it one way and one the other way, and that's why it's recorded differently in these two baraitot, although they are both in the name of Rabbi Meir. And now we ask further, Kashya de Rabbi Eliezer ad Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer also seems to have said two different things.
In the third Baraita, he said it's when Shabbat begins, when it becomes sanctified. And in the Mishnah, if we read the Mishnah in a simple way that says, when can you say Shema? From the time that Kohanim eat Terumah until the end of Sof Ashmona Shana, Rabbi Eliezer. If we assume that Rabbi Eliezer is the author of this entire answer, not only of Sof Ashmona Rishona, but he's the one that said when the Kohanim can eat, well then we have a contradiction. Rabbi Eliezer here says when the Kohanim can eat Terumah, and in the third Baraita, he said it's from the time when Shabbat begins. And so the answer here is the same. Tere Tanae Alibad Rabbi Eliezer. There's two Tanaitic traditions, two memorizers that said different things, both in the name of Rabbi Eliezer. So yes, it is in fact a contradiction. It would be possible, by the way, if you say that Kadash Hayom means when you say Kiddush, and maybe this time of saying Kiddush is Set HaKochavim. So it might be possible to reconcile it, but either way, it's different language certainly. So maybe these are simply two traditions, or a better answer, maybe the beginning of the Mishnah is in fact not Rabbi Eliezer. You can read it very nicely as such, that the earliest time is when the Kohanim eat Terumah. Period. That is anonymous. That's agreed by everybody because there's no machloket about this. And so that is said by the anonymous author of the Mishnah. And then Rabbi Eliezer's words start with Ad Sof Ashmona Rishona. That's all that Rabbi Eliezer said. And then there's no contradiction at all. Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah did not express anything about the beginning. And so his opinion would be only expressed in the Baraita, that it's at the beginning of when Shabbat becomes holy. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.